Good evening and welcome to the Gin and Tonic Show. Wishing you all a happy new year again. And I want to welcome my co-panelists, as always, Stop Spamming.
Hi,
and
guys.
we have a surprise guest here by the name of Hassan. I don't want to say your last name unless you want that to be said.
Hassan Radwan. That's fine. Everyone knows me, I think.
Brilliant. So just to put it in context here, I have seen, and we'll be talking a little bit later about some censorship and hate, which is obviously the sort of main topic, even though we may talk about other things tonight. And I noticed Hassan talking in some of these Facebook groups, asking very relevant, very cogent questions and getting all kinds of responses and a little bit of emotion and so forth, as one sometimes does from Muslims. And he just kept asking these really good questions. I thought, wow, who's this gentleman? And I reached out on Facebook, and he had a few moments. So he's going to be with us for a very short time this evening. So Hassan, maybe you could just share a little bit of who you are, where you came from.
Yeah, sure.
You have an interest in this.
I'll introduce myself. My name is Hassan Radwan. I was born Muslim. I've been a Muslim all my life. I started having doubts. I was a teacher in Islamic school as well. And I've written books for Muslim children. So I was very into the deen, and I was very religious. I started having doubts towards, I was nearly 40, I was around 48, 49. And I started questioning things. And the doubts just grew and grew. I started questioning things in the Quran. And I eventually decided that, I didn't believe in it anymore. I didn't believe that the Quran was the word of God. I want to clear up one thing, because Stop Spamming, my old friend from the Gin and Tonic Show, mentioned that he heard that I'd gone back to Islam. For a while, I toyed with the label agnostic Muslim, really because I wanted to help. I felt that I had a duty to kind of help positive change and reform. But eventually that felt disingenuous, so I gave that up, and I just labeled myself agnostic now. I'm just me, Hassan. But the thing about Islam, I was talking to a friend of mine who's also an ex-Muslim, and he said to me, do you have anything to do with Islam anymore? And I said, well, the thing is that you may leave Islam, but Islam kind of never really leaves you. It's it's all around in my family and friends, and it's part of who I am. I grew up, with the Quran and the Hadiths and many of the cultural things around me. So it's very difficult to kind of leave that circle. But as far as belief goes, I don't believe the Quran is the word of God. I was just saying that I think there are some very good parts of the Quran. I think the Quran is an amazing book in many ways. But I think if we were to judge it as just purely a piece of human literature, I think we could judge it quite well as a book produced in the 7th century. But it's the problem that it's not being presented as a piece of human literature. It's being presented as the divine word of God, perfect linguistically and morally. And so then we have to judge it a little more harshly, I'm afraid. And it doesn't come off too well then.
So share with us, because we're always very critical of Islam on the show here. So if it were, a good human book, as you say, maybe highlight one or two things, because I know you mentioned it just before we went on air. One or two of the things that you feel are, in fact, pretty good in the Quran. Yeah,
I mean, I like the idea of personal responsibility. There's a verse in the Quran. Sorry, my memory is going a bit. لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. That no person shall carry the burden of another. So I always like this in contrast to Christianity, which always said that we had this idea of original sin hanging over our head. And I always felt that, that didn't seem to make sense to me, that we're responsible for Adam and Eve in paradise. I felt that, we should be responsible for ourselves. So I always liked that. Islam lays a lot of stress on charity, which I think is a wonderful thing. There's a lot of verses about charity, giving to orphans, giving to the poor. There's a lot of quite mystical, beautiful verses. There's the verse of the light and the verse of the chair, Ayatul Kursi, which are quite beautiful, mystical verses, that God is light upon light within a light and within a niche and so on. And of course, all the Gnostics and the Sufis love those sort of verses. And there's a lot of, sort of good injunctions, washing your hands and keeping yourself clean and doing all this, these sort of sensible things, which, I mean, one doesn't really need a god to tell them those things, but they're good things. Treatment, I think that you know, the fact that the Quran came in an environment where there was slavery and misogyny, that in the 7th century context, it tried to deal with those things. And I think, as I say, looking at it purely as a piece of human literature, I think that's laudable. I think that it you know, it did make attempts. And I was saying that I did for a while. I used to give khutbas, Friday sermons, and I used to sort of pick out these lovely verses and hadith. There's some lovely hadith which, for example, that God doesn't look at your outwardness or your money or your wealth, but he looks at your heart and your actions, and that the best of you is the best in character, and the one who gives charity, and do not backbite, and all those other things which are in the Quran and hadith. And I used to give khutbas about all the nice things, highlighting the nice things, but I was saying that the material actually is quite sparse. I mean, you do run out of it after a while, and I ended up repeating myself quite a lot, because there's all these other verses which I was avoiding, about people burning in hell and having their skins roasted off and replaced, and hooked rods of iron dragging them through fetid water, and so much attack on kafirs, people who don't believe that they are the worst of creation, the worst of creatures. And there's, of course, the verses, you know, like that a man is allowed to hit his wife under certain circumstances, after 2 other steps. I mean, I think that was the one that actually kind of broke the camel's back, because I just couldn't believe that God would sanction a man hitting his wife under any circumstances. It just didn't seem right. And then the more the doubt started coming, the more I looked into it, the more it kind of just fell apart. And I think that, you know, like most Muslims, I you know, grew up believing this was true. We didn't read the Quran with a critical eye. We read it with devotion. It was an act of worship to read the Quran, and so we never really sort of looked at it critically. It was always filtering out those nasty bits. It was always, oh, these horrible people are trying to twist the Quran and make it, you know. And it's only when that sort of veil drops that you look at it critically and you realize, yeah, there's actually quite a lot of stuff in there which, you know, how on earth did I not noticed that before? It's like looking at one of those pictures by Escher. I don't know whether you ever looked at those pictures where they have the stairs going up and down, and they don't make sense. The more you look at it, you think, oh gosh, I didn't notice that before. I suddenly started looking at the Quran in that way. It was like, oh my goodness, how did that pass me by? Ma malakat aymanukum, you know, what your right hand possesses. Well, that's slavery, you know, and it's sanctioning it. You know, as I say, if you look at it as a piece of human literature, it's trying to set boundaries and good treatment for slaves. But as a book that is supposed to be the book for all times and all places, it's allowing it for all times and all places. And it's no surprise that you've got some Muslims. I mean, you know, a majority of Muslims are you know, impose their own humanity and look for the good. But there are some Muslims, like, you know, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on, all these groups, who just want to take us back to the 7th century and live in a very sort of backward, barbaric way.
Yes, I mean, one of the things you brought up there, which was sort of one of the, you said the straw that broke the camel's back about the beating, and of course, no doubt you've probably heard every apologist a response to this. No, it's not really beating, as long as they don't hurt, you know, these sort of things. And
I always find that such nonsense. I mean, even for argument's sake, let's say it's a symbolic light little tap. And the Quran doesn't say light at all. I mean, in a lot of translations, it says light. What that comes from is there's a hadith which says غير مبرح. So the hitting should be not harsh. So it shouldn't be a harsh hitting. And from that, many of the scholars say, oh, well, it should be just a symbolic light hitting. But try and just, I mean, I said this once before, just try and picture it. You know, there are 3 steps. The first one is you talk to your wife. You explain to her, you know, that she's been rebellious. And that's another thing we should, you know, once you look, what does the rebellion mean? It often means not beautifying herself and making herself look pretty and so on. So you talk to her. And then the next step is separating in bed. Okay, so those 2 seem kind of reasonable, talking and separation. But if that doesn't work, وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, hit them. So you say, okay, darling, I've talked to you and it didn't work. We've tried a separation and it didn't work. So now I want you just to stand still, my darling. I'm going to get my little miswak or my handkerchief or my little symbolic thing, and I'm going to tap you a few times on your shoulder, tap, tap, tap. Right. What's she supposed to do? She's supposed to say, yeah, when you talked to me, it didn't make any sense. When we separated, it didn't make any sense. But now that you've tapped me symbolically on my shoulder, it all makes sense, and I'm going to stop my bad ways. It's ridiculous. It's an insult to intelligence, to be honest with you.
Yeah, but there's an updated version now, because now it's no longer the miswak and no longer the tapping, but now it's leaving.
Now it's
leaving.
Leaving. No, I've heard that as well. But that linguistically is wrong as well.
Of course it is, but this is the latest attempt.
I mean, that's just embarrassing, to be honest with you. It's embarrassing. I can tell you it's wadribuhunna, which means to hit them, and it takes the verb directly. If it was to leave, it'd have to be wadribu anhunna, and there's no way that you can say wadribuhunna means leave them. It's absurd. It makes no sense.
Sorry, I was just doing that. So what's your views now? Obviously you're a non-believer, and obviously I picked you up on a Facebook chat, and even here you're very articulate. You're just sharing your views, and of course this seems to get we've had a few in the chat here, etc. And again, they're not representative. I'm very clear that one or a few Muslims don't represent them all, but there definitely seems to be a lot of emotional responses, particularly to ex-Muslims. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think the Hyde Park Corner group, which you've got there, seems to be these dour merchant type groups that head off down to Hyde Park, and they are quite traditional and orthodox in their views. There are different types of Muslims, of course, but these dour merchants are really very kind of, I would say, strict Salafi types, really, most of them. They're very orthodox, and they believe that. I think I raised the point about apostasy, and they were quite okay with saying that in an Islamic state, an apostate should be killed for his disbelief. And so I think you'll find a lot of Muslims, they will not say that. So they will not say that. They will try and sort of make up apologetics for it, that it's not in this day and age, or it's it's a type of treason, or something like that. But I think that particular group, the Hyde Park group, seems to be quite an orthodox fundamentalist group.
Yeah, I think a couple of them sort of respond with apostasy is okay if you keep it to yourself. The moment you go out into the street, and they equate it with treason. How they get to treason is just beyond me, but this is how some people think or attempt to think. And so that's when it's really, now if you're in a Sharia state, now you can be put to death.
I'm going to have to go off for a minute. Can I go and come back?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No problem at all. You've got the link, so join us again when you're ready. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks.
Cheerio.
Thank you. Cheerio now.